Okay, thank you very much. I'm expecting double sandwiches for this additional work. So thank you very much indeed. This is a synthesis paper, but at the same time, it doesn't really actually manage to address or it doesn't manage to answer the questions, let's say. But what we try to do is to kind of build on the different literature that's there, build on some of the things that we've talked about this morning, to try and sort of tease out a little bit where it is that we might want to look to get a better sort of understanding, therefore, of these different employment dynamics that we've been talking about this morning. So basically, the challenge, I think, is relatively clear. We talk about jobs are central, but not at the center of policy. I think we've heard that various times this morning. There is this sort of huge wave of youth entering the African workforce, and I think I almost put 11 million times 1. I think it's quite important to think of these 11 million not just as different figures. So this is just the African workforce, but this is sort of individuals aspiring to make an income, to finance or feed their families, etc. So the story of the numbers are big. Jobs and employment are recognized at being at this nexus of growth, poverty reduction, and inequality. But then, as this quote says, the employment problem and the poverty problem are symptoms of Africa's lack of structural change. So what we're trying to do here is to kind of zoom out from these quite sort of detailed, specific individual level problems and address them through this broader story about structural change. And as you'll know, I mean, for many, I focus particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and in sub-Saharan Africa, the big story these days is about economic transformation. So employment jobs are there as a key target, but the idea is to have this structural transformation that brings jobs, so to get away from jobless growth. So that raises this challenge of how to raise productivity within sectors. So how to get more output from the same people, how to get higher wages, therefore, from the same sectors, but how to also avoid that from people moving out of those sectors, they then undermine the overall progress that the country's making. So if, for example, in Vietnam, we were talking about the privatization of state firms, if people then move from these modest productivity jobs to very low productivity jobs, then at a macro level, the economy doesn't benefit. So that's the kind of the challenge, and all within these complex environments. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So I've called this a kind of framework because it certainly doesn't intend to be a very tight theoretical framework. But basically, when you look through the different analyses that exist, we looked at, for example, the World Bank's Miles framework. We looked at the IMF framework, the ILO frameworks. Basically, everything comes down to how to address job demand or labor demand, the actual sort of drivers of job creation, and then how to address the aspect of labor supply. So it's a very kind of simple two-way relationship. But as was discussed earlier on this morning, and when we talk about decent jobs, it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality of those jobs, and it's also about having access to those jobs. So obviously we're bringing in new sort of complexities already by just bringing these to the fore in terms of and there's a possibility of trade-off is the other point. And there's this interaction then with what's going on within different sectors and what's going on between different sectors. So some of you who will probably be familiar with this graph, this is from Macmillan and her colleagues, basically looking at regional growth patterns across Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and high-income countries. And those of you who are familiar with the literature will know that the first version of this paper actually went from 1990 to 2005. And if we focus just on Africa, just to take an example, basically what you found was that within sector productivity was positive, but what was happening about people switching sectors was actually lowering the productivity across Africa. So this is looking at a very general level. So the dark blue represents the contribution to growth from within sector productivity growth. So that's sort of technological upscaling, improvements in management methods, improvements in training. Whereas the light blue, the structural part, is to do with people moving from one sector to another. So if they're moving into this more productive jobs, from a low productive to a high productivity job, then that gets reflected as a positive contribution to growth. So just Africa, just again to zoom in the period 90 to 99, the switch from people switching from one sector to another was actually reducing, it was actually undermining growth, basically because people were moving into low productivity jobs. So this is something that's changed then, as the graph shows, for looking after 2000. And what we wanted to do then was to try and get in a little bit into more detail, looking for some of the development progress countries. As we said, the project basically looks at, how many countries did it look at? I can't remember now. There's more than 13, but...
In total across the whole phase of the project, we've looked at about 40 odd countries.
Okay, so there's 40 odd countries, but basically looking for data availability, we came down to these 13 countries, which are being looked at for these different dimensions which we talked about in the introduction. So basically this is now doing a similar exercise but looking at different sectoral contributions to growth. And basically I think there are two main things to draw from this. The first is a little bit, as we heard this morning already, the importance of the services sector. So across almost all across all countries apart from Cambodia, Thailand and Vietnam, the services sector has been the key contributor to GDP or value added per capita. And what you can see is that actually for Uganda particularly, but also Mongolia and even South Africa, that the agricultural sector has actually been undermining growth. So that's to say that productivity within those sectors has been declining, so this has been undermining the overall growth. And again, this is something that we need to kind of try and understand at a narrower level. And basically, before we do that, just to highlight, so we're talking about labour productivity patterns within sectors, so it's a little bit our quality story. Higher productivity jobs are associated with higher incomes, so that's the quality aspect. Labour productivity patterns from switching between sectors then is these people who are moving from one sector to another, hopefully from low to high. And then demographic growth actually also takes a role here as well, of course. So rising output within the country comes from these three different possibilities. And the point is that all can boost or undermine growth. And not only that, but I think as I highlight there are trade-offs even in amongst these figures. So even a drop in productivity in the non-agricultural sector may be associated with rising labour intensity. So it's not that productivity is key. Obviously, productivity is important. Here we're talking about average productivity. But since we're also trying to think about numbers of jobs, the quantity of jobs, then this labour intensity story also then has to come in. So I'm not going to spend too long on this paper, on this table, but basically the three broad columns there basically refer to the three origins of increasing value added. So the contribution of within the sector, the contribution, so that's in the first column, the contribution of changes in employment, so this is new entrants into these three different sectors, and then the contribution of intersectoral shifts, so this is people moving from one sector to another. So just to take Uganda, since that was the country that we discussed earlier this morning, you can see that actually within sectors, although, well, we talked about services sector has been the highest growth, but it's not the one that's had the highest rising productivity. So industrial sector productivity has risen the highest, which was what we talked about this morning. But then if you move into the next column, what you see is that that rise in productivity doesn't take into account the number of people working in the sector. So if you incorporate the number of people entering that sector from outside, they've actually undermined productivity. And if you look at people switching into, basically people have been switching out of industry into agriculture and into services. So this is where you see the services has positive across the board. So more people are coming in, which is boosting productivity. The productivity within the sector is also rising, and people are moving from lower productivity sectors into services, which is boosting their own productivity. And without wanting to spend too much time on it, this contrasts actually with Ethiopia. So if you look at Ethiopia, just the second one in the line there, what we have is that the services, the productivity growth has been much higher in agriculture. So that has contributed or there has been rising productivity. But again, this story about the number of people actually entering the sector has undermined that, slightly offset by people switching from low productivity sectors into perhaps subsectors of agriculture which are higher productivity. So this then already, it gives you some sense of different patterns across countries, the different importance of within sector productivity and people shifting between. So that also helps us to think about labour mobility. But the other thing is that it also highlights the importance of going beyond these very broad sectors. In agriculture, we're talking about commercial agriculture plus relatively informal agriculture. Most of the data, I should say, comes from household surveys plus labour force surveys. that are then kind of tallied with macro data. So there is an element of the informal sector which is in here. So these broad sectors unfortunately capture a bit too many sectors. So within the paper, what we try to do then is to zoom in from those 13 countries into 3, basically from the different income group categories, and basically just to look at Ethiopia. There, if we break down industry, actually we're talking about mining, manufacturing, utilities, and construction. And if you look at the changes in value added, so the first column, the changes in value added, actually it's mostly mining. But when you look at the productivity change for mining, that's actually been declining. And the sort of the highest productivity change in the industry sector has actually been in utilities. So as we've seen, the productivity patterns are actually going negative. But then when you look into the services, we have a breakdown between trade services, which are the more sort of traditional services, and then transport services and business services, which are more of our modern services. And there, basically, you can still see, yes, services across the 3 of them have been, their value added has been rising across the 3, actually. But actually, it's only transport services where productivity has been increasing. So in the others, which we're talking about retail services, and in the case of Ethiopia, where banking and ICT are actually excluded, basically, from or highly regulated, let's say, they haven't got the same productivity boost that you might see elsewhere. But the point is that within these different sectors, we need to be able to start looking at the variation in terms of what's happening with productivity growth, with movements between these sectors, and then what that then means for job quality and quantity. And of course, the big point to mention here is that the informality is the key part of the economy pretty much across the developing world. That was mentioned in the Ghana case. It was mentioned for Uganda. And although these data that I mentioned capture some informal activity, the point is that if we really want to understand what's happening in terms of those dynamics, we need to begin to look into those types of jobs. If we're talking about 35% of GDP, so these are various different measures or different estimates of informal sector. But basically looking at the lowest income quartile, we're talking around about 30 to 40% of the economy, which is in informal hands. And another point to make about that is also the fact of the secondary employment. So a point that was raised in Uganda this morning about household diversification of incomes. And one of the points, I think, is that even for households that are primarily occupied in agriculture, are increasingly beginning to diversify their incomes into other activities. So basically, within the agricultural sector and within sort of informal agriculture, we can actually kind of see many transformations that are possible from non-paid employment and self-employment in agriculture to some kind of self-employment in non-agricultural sectors, so already beginning to generate some income, towards wage and salaried work in agriculture. So there's a kind of continuum that goes way beyond just agriculture or even commercial and non-commercial. That there are these different degrees, and this role of secondary activities, although relatively minor, given the share of the informal economy, this secondary activity could be a key driver of poverty reduction. So this is a little bit, so what do we know about the different policies that manage to affect these different dynamics? And this is where, we kind of cover the broad different levels of policies, and this is what's kind of been discussed this morning, really. Sorry, I'm ignoring that side of the room here. We can talk about macroeconomic policies, and I think it was interesting. Obviously, price stability and exchange rates are important. So we could say even the story in Ghana of focusing on the depreciation of the cedi could be seen as an important aspect for looking at structural change. But obviously beyond that, if we want to talk beyond stability, then there has to be more of a kind of proactive vision of this. And if we're talking about putting employment at the core of policy, then understanding how these different macroeconomic policies affect different sectors then could potentially be a lever for focusing more sectorally on employment. Obviously, there are sectoral policies that have been used. We heard in terms of Sri Lanka the discussion of industrial policy, looking at economic zones. Even in the post-war reconstruction, there was discussion of infrastructures, the importance of fiscal incentives, etc. So we can look at these different policies at different levels. So the macroeconomic, the sectoral level, and then when we talk about policies for firm growth, there's obviously a whole new range of literature that talks about learning, capabilities, and also actually the switch. So in Ethiopia, what's been found, for example, is that many of the manufacturing firms that exist have actually started out as trading firms. So even there we have sectoral shifts of firms taking employment with them, but it's part of this sort of adaptation and growing sort of lesson learning, let's say, within the economy. So there are questions sort of for policymakers about how to either build on that or even to further promote it. And then, of course, the story about informalization and employment quality. If, in fact, some of these policies are pushing people out of the formal sector and creating informal employment, which is what sort of the negative contribution of agriculture, for example, is potentially doing, then there is a question about should we be focusing on big firms versus little firms? How should we deal with informalization? Is formalization really a viable policy? Looking more on the labour supply side then, we've heard a lot about we've heard a lot about TVET actually, but in the case of Uganda, what Laura was talking about this morning, actually primary education and basic literacy play a major role in the household level of diversification. So these miniature level, super microeconomic transformations that are taking place at the household level may still come from quite broad literacy policies or primary education. And then, of course, when we get into TVET, there is this targeting. There is an ability to look at mismatches, but as was mentioned several times, there are also challenges in terms of taking that forward too. There's an interesting story which was mentioned from Ghana in our paper, which is to do with apprenticeships and trying to build on informal knowledge and informal capabilities. So less thinking about formalization than seeing the informal sector as a potential source of learning. And so there have been sort of pilot schemes to try and formalize basically the apprenticeship scheme. Obviously, social protection and public works can also play an important role. That's something particularly in Ethiopia, for example, where public works programs have contributed to the important role of construction, and arguably also have helped in terms of diversifying incomes in rural areas and reducing rural poverty. So this was just a quick graph to show the relationship between schooling and wage employment. I mean, basically, wage employment may exclude a large part of the population, but if that's what we're aiming for, then education, generally put, is obviously a key contributor. But one of the points that has come back several times is this story about politics. In Glowen's presentation, she was talking particularly about party politics and the point that different projects relate to different parties, that these have sort of limited sustainability with governments changing. But I think beyond party politics, when we talk about politics, we're also just talking about impacting on different groups with different interests. So from the policy world, if we're now looking forward about how now to design different policies to promote job creation, I think there's a change now in thinking from talking about best practice. So, well, actually what we need is a TVET system like this. What we need are labour market institutions like this. Much more into sort of best fit. So in the case of Vietnam, for example, perhaps it's a bad example, but how would you work actually with the fact that at the moment public sector jobs are paid for? And how do you affect the incentives then that within that to try and encourage people away from that, encourage people into the private sector? So I think what's becoming more and more sort of acknowledged in the literature is this sort of primacy of politics, where you can even go further and talk about sort of political survival as the key interest of political elites. And if this is the case, then what is the political pressure for them to create jobs? So Claire was mentioning the fact that employment and jobs are highly political, they are highly visible. But given that in Tunisia, for example, there was still highly educated people, a lot of unemployment, but the government managed to stay in power for a considerable length of time. So there is then this question about, okay, so how can we look at these different sectoral changes and link those to political incentives? This table at the bottom, maybe I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think it helps to think about the private sector and the kind of jobs we're talking about along these two different axes. And this is from Lant Pritchett, who basically divides the market into export-oriented and domestic market and high-rent sectors and competitive sectors. And I think perhaps it's just to highlight that those operating in high-rent sectors in a domestic market are the power brokers. So those are working with government. Those people are able to exercise power politically. And if you go to the opposite corner in the top right, those basically looking at export markets in the competitive industry are sort of magicians, he calls them. So basically to conclude, just on time, I think, it's an unarguable truth that most growth in most developing countries has come from the services sector. And the presentation again on Ghana was talking about having skipped the industrial sector, so industrialization wasn't taking place. But what this does then is it raises these questions about what's happening within those sectors then, and what more can we find about employment quality and quantity when we start looking at these within and between sector dynamics. I think the story about household level diversification is very important, but often not discussed actually. And obviously it's a very low level, but it still has an important role given the scale of rural households especially. So these differences need taken into account. I think one of the points that came out of the case studies is that employment progress has often been a kind of secondary outcome. So it's again this story that actually SEZs even in Sri Lanka were more focused on creating foreign exchange than actually creating jobs. So basically, maybe I can just finish with a final quote there. This is the recent paper from Danny Roderick, saying that Africa's growth, if it happens, will not be from industrialization, from agriculture or services. So then the question is, what can we say more about policies and the roles of different actors when we talk about this? Thank you.